The war to end all wars had just ended in 1918. Millions of men were left dead and thousands of acres of land left decimated. After the war, a great prosperity filtered into the American economic system, as well as those abroad. The Roaring Twenties, full of short skirts and the new Model T Ford, added to the excitement of the era, brought about by the prosperity. The emotions of this new post-war time flowed into the art and literature, which took on radically new styles, such as the flow of consciousness, in reaction to the horror and destruction of World War I. An author who is exemplary of this movement is James Joyce. Joyce was born on February 22nd, 1882, near Dublin, Ireland. He kept his Irish heritage foremost in his mind when writing throughout his entire life, and proved to be one of the most innovative and provocative initiators of the new style. In his work, Dubliners, Joyce reveals the many phases and aspects of a life in Dublin, and reveals to the reader some of his deeply rooted ideas and emotions. There are ways in which a common setting and common techniques promote the unity of Dubliners. Another source of this unity is the recurrent themes which bind the stories together. The single most prominent and emphasized theme in Dubliners is the paralysis of the individual spirit and of the community. Also, the order of the stories in Dubliners represents the chronological progression of a non-specific person through life. There are stories that are specifically grouped to represent childhood, adolescence, maturity, public life, and death. In the first story, Sisters, this recurrent theme of paralysis is announced by the very first paragraph under the guise of a paralyzed priest. Sisters is also a story that represents the childhood section of the book. In this story, a small boy experiences a religious dream that takes place far away in the east, in Persia. This idea of dreaming about the east also occurs several times in Dubliners. Sisters was meant by Joyce to be a sort of introduction and overview for Dubliners, which explains all of the recurrent items that are introduced in the story. The little boy, with dreams and inspirations, will mature and develop through the other stories in Dubliners and reveal the personal views of Joyce himself. The little boy appears again in Araby. Here, the boy becomes obsessed with a girl. The overly sensitive boy begins to dream constantly about her, and dreams again set in the east. In Araby, we again see the young boy who feels restrained by his lifestyle and resorts to his only escape from his disillusionment, dreaming. This small boy is the personification of Joyce's experiences, and he shows Joyce's views of the moral paralysis of Ireland. Araby is the last of the stories in Dubliners that Joyce meant to deal with childhood and the effects of Ireland's downfalls on a child. Two Gallants represents the section of Dubliners that deals with adolescence. It tells of two young and adventurous men who are part of the scandalous Dublin city life. They hold no jobs and have no permanent home. They live by their schemes, deals, and other less than legitimate means. In this particular story, they were able to convince a young lady to give them money just by their clever means. These ways of life are considered by Joyce to represent adolescence, not in age, but in attitudes. This type of situation is one of the aspects of Dublin life that Joyce criticized. It shows how the young people are corrupt, engage in loathsome lifestyles that could eventually be detrimental. A Little Cloud is one of the two stories in Dubliners that deals with maturity. In the previous stories, such as Two Gallants, immature lifestyles of whim and adventure were depicted. However, in this story, Joyce depicts the nature of maturity and adulthood. It shows a well-established journalist who has a wife and a child, lives in a nice house, and lives a generally regular, monotonous life. He meets with an old friend who has taken on a life of travel, adventure, and pleasure. After this meeting, the normal gentleman, known as Chandler, regrets the life he had led. This story is meant by Joyce to show the boring lives that Dublin adults take on upon maturing. However, it also shows how some people retain their adolescent lifestyles throughout the rest of their life and never fully mature. This is exemplified by Chandler's gallivanting friend, Ignatius Gallagher, who has spent his years traveling to Paris, London, and other urban centers of adventure and pleasure. At the end of the story, we see Chandler's inner conflict over the two lifestyles. Again, Joyce shows his ideas of paralysis, this time through Chandler's own inner conflict. Counterparts is the other of the two stories in Dubliners that deals with maturity. Again, Joyce shows the effects of adulthood and maturity on the individual. In this story, we see an office clerk, Farrington, struggling to keep his job. His boss, Elaine, is constantly deriding him for his lack of performance. Farrington comes to his wits' end and verbally defends himself, which was seen as insubordinance by Elaine. Farrington then spends his last penny on drinking with friends that night. While in a pub that night, Farrington, once considered a powerful man, was beaten in an arm wrestling match. Farrington, because of these frustrating series of events, becomes erratic and furious. When he gets home, he lashes out on his son, beating him with a stick. Counterparts is full of symbolic overtones that expand the sketch into significant commentaries on Irish life. The conflict between Farrington and Elaine, for example, is endowed with political and national overtones by a reference to Elaine's North of Ireland accent. Suddenly, we realize that the struggle between Farrington and Elaine reflects a national predicament, and that the force behind Elaine, that's the employer, Mr. Crosby, may well represent England. Thus, Farrington's defeat in the pub becomes an emblem of Ireland's national disgrace. The final scene, where Farrington beats his son for no reason, becomes the epitome of Ireland's inner corruption. In Ivy Day in the Committee Room, the political and moral paralysis of contemporary Dublin life is exposed through a series of contrasts between the stifling atmosphere of the committee room and the heroic career of Ireland's dead hero, Charles Stewart Parnell, in whose honor the ivy is worn. This story is unique because it does not have a plot. It is also part of the set of stories in Dubliners that deals with public life. Ivy Day in the Committee Room is the one story in Dubliners that truly is a political satire, because it shows how the political life that is expected of Irish citizens affects the individual. The story The Dead, unlike Ivy Day in the Committee Room, does have a plot. Also, The Dead is the final story in Dubliners, in which it serves as an epilogue. However, this story was not in the original printing. It was later added at the end of the second printing and proved to be the longest and most substantial story in the collection. The Dead brings the themes of all the other stories into vital relationship with each other, while at the same time it traces a complex process of self-recognition which purges Dubliners of all vestiges of provincialism. The hero of the story, Gabriel Conroy, bears the name of the archangel who will one day wake the dead. The Dead also shows Joyce's intimate knowledge of the musical culture of Dublin and of the theatre. Miss Morkan's dance is a well-rehearsed affair in which Gabriel is a key figure both as a manager and as a principal actor. Interestingly enough, in this story, Gabriel can be paralleled directly with Joyce because Gabriel, like Joyce, was the urban fellow who fell in love with the country girl. In Dubliners, James Joyce brought together the division which lay within the tradition of the English short story. Joyce wrote with continental models in mind, and he managed to preserve the poetic unity of the short tale while also exploring a wide range of human experience. This masterpiece of flow of consciousness is an enlargement of the genre which became elevated through its subtle handling of symbol and motif. Although the short stories in Dubliners do take on the quality of lyric moments, they do not limit themselves to a single aspect of life. Araby is focused on a single intense experience, the young boy's disillusionment, but this is expanded widely on the symbolic level. Even in The Dead, the most novelistic of the stories, Joyce organized Gabriel's experience around a few lyric moments. Most importantly, the general form of the collection, with its elaborate correspondences and recurring themes, shows that Joyce had managed to reconcile the lyric aim of the short tale with the more architectural concerns of the novel.